My name is Caleb Hutto. I'm 44 years old. I live in a small house about a quarter-mile from the harbor, in a town on the South Carolina coast that most people drive through on their way to somewhere else, which has always suited me fine. My wife Denise runs the front office for a marine supply company in town. My son Jacob is 19 and crews for me on the Patricia Ann during summers, when he's not taking classes at the technical college, learning diesel mechanics, which I tell him is a smarter long-term plan than following his old man out onto the water full-time, even though some part of me would be lying if I said I didn't hope he'd stay. I've fished these waters for 26 years. I started as a teenager working for other captains, learned the trade the way most of us do, by being cold, wet, and corrected often, until eventually you stop needing the correction. I've run my own boat, the Patricia Ann, for 14 years now. She's a 38-foot commercial vessel, rigged for both shrimping and occasional charter work depending on the season. Named for my grandmother, who raised 4 children on a deckhand's wages and never once in 81 years of life complained about the size of what she had. Our harbor sits at the inland end of a channel that opens, about a mile and a half down, into a much larger marina, Reyes Harbor, a private facility with deep water slips for boats that most working fishermen will never own. A yacht club building with a wraparound porch overlooking the water and a membership roster that reads like the donor wall of a hospital. The channel connecting the two harbors is shared water, which means commercial boats like mine and the recreational and luxury vessels docked at Reyes Harbor have navigated past each other for as long as both harbors have existed. Charlotte Reyes inherited the marina from her father about 9 years ago and has spent a good portion of those 9 years trying to change that shared arrangement. She's brought proposals to the town council twice. Once to restrict commercial vessel traffic during peak recreational hours. Once to impose a transit fee on working boats using her stretch of channel, despite the channel being public navigable water that no private entity actually owns the right to toll. Both proposals failed, but not before several contentious public meetings, where Charlotte made her position about as clear as a position can be made. At the second of those meetings, responding to a fisherman who asked why commercial boats should be treated as a problem to be managed rather than a community that had used those waters for generations, she said, and this is close to verbatim because the local paper printed it, "I'm not trying to be unkind, but there's a difference between a working harbor and a destination marina. And frankly, boats like that don't belong in the same water as a $500,000 yacht. It's about the experience we're offering our members." I want to be honest that I didn't take that personally in any deep way at the time. I've heard versions of that sentiment for 26 years, from various people in various rooms, and I've learned that arguing with it rarely changes the sentiment, only the volume of the room. I kept running my boat through the shared channel the way I always had, because it was public water, and I had every legal right to be there. And I let Charlotte Reyes feel however she wanted to feel about it. The yacht club dinner happened on a Friday evening in early spring, the club's annual gathering, a black tie affair that draws members and prominent local figures, held in the clubhouse overlooking the marina. I learned, only afterward, that a junior administrative employee, working from an old community outreach list that the club had apparently used in some previous year for a different kind of event, had included my name on the dinner invitation roster by mistake. I received an invitation in the mail, assumed it was some kind of general harbor community gesture, and decided, mostly out of curiosity about what the inside of that building actually looked like after years of driving past it, to go. I wore the one suit I own, which has seen exactly the number of occasions you'd expect from a man who fishes for a living, and I walked into the Reyes Harbor Yacht Club a little before 7, feeling distinctly aware of being underdressed in a building full of people who were not. I found Charlotte Reyes near the entrance, checking guests against a list with a club staff member. She looked at me, really looked, the particular up-and-down assessment that doesn't take long to complete, and then looked at the list. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, in a tone that was polite on its surface and entirely clear underneath it. "I don't see your name associated with a membership or sponsor account. This is a member event." "I received an invitation," I said, and showed her the card. She took it, examined it, and I watched her expression shift into the specific kind of controlled irritation that comes from identifying an administrative error in front of an audience. "This appears to have been sent in error," she said. "We occasionally include the harbor community list for outreach events, but this is our member dinner specifically." She handed the card back. I apologize for the confusion, but I don't think this is the right event for you. A few nearby guests had by this point noticed the exchange, the way people in formal settings always notice exchanges that carry an edge to them. I run a boat out of the harbor down the channel, I said, not as an argument, just as information. Fishing mostly. I'm aware, Charlotte said, which is exactly why I'm confident this isn't the event you were meant to attend. This dinner is for our membership, people who maintain a relationship with this facility on the terms it's designed for. I don't say that to be unkind, it's simply not the right fit. She gave a small, practiced smile, the kind that closes a conversation rather than continuing it. I hope you understand. I did understand, in the sense that I understood exactly what she meant and had heard close enough to the same sentence from her at a town council podium 2 years earlier. I did not argue, I did not make a scene. I thanked her for the clarification, turned around, walked back to my truck, and drove home, where Denise asked how the dinner was, and I told her honestly that it had been short. I want to be clear that I did not spend the following 11 days nursing any particular resentment about this. It was, in the scheme of 26 years on the water, a minor and almost unsurprising moment. I went back to fishing. The shrimp were running well that spring. Jacob came out on weekends between classes. Life continued in the unremarkable way it mostly does. 11 days after the dinner, on a Tuesday afternoon, I was coming back into the harbor with a decent haul when I heard chatter on the VHF radio that made me slow the boat and actually listen. The Coast Guard had a search underway about 4 miles offshore, in a stretch of water that had gone thick with an unusual fog bank that had rolled in faster than the morning forecast predicted. A recreational sailboat, single occupant, had failed to return from what was supposed to be a short afternoon sail and had not responded to radio contact in over 2 hours. I didn't know at first whose boat it was. I learned the name a few minutes later, when another local captain came over the radio asking for clarification. The missing vessel was the Charlotte Ann, registered to a man named Richard Reyes. Charlotte's husband. I want to describe honestly what went through my mind in that moment, because I think the honesty matters more than the drama of the situation. I did not think about the yacht club dinner. I did not think about the channel disputes or the town council meetings or the specific sentence about $500,000 yachts. I thought, simply and immediately, about the fog bank I could see building on the horizon, about how fast conditions change in that kind of weather, and about the specific knowledge I had, 14 years of running that exact stretch of coastline, that the Coast Guard's search pattern, based on the last known position and standard drift calculations, was almost certainly searching the wrong area. The thing about that particular stretch of water, the thing that takes years on a boat to actually understand rather than read about, is that the tidal current runs in a counterintuitive pattern around a submerged shoal about 3 miles south of where most boats assume it runs, because the visible surface current and the actual subsurface current diverge in a way that has confused more than a few rescue searches over the years. I had learned this the hard way, years earlier, helping search for a different missing boat, and I had spent enough subsequent seasons confirming the pattern that I trusted it completely. I turned the Patricia Ann around and headed back out, radioing the Coast Guard to report my position and my intention to assist, which is standard practice, and which they acknowledged without much comment. Because at that point in an active search, every capable vessel matters. I ran south, against the search pattern the Coast Guard cutter was working, trusting 14 years of accumulated knowledge about water that doesn't behave the way the charts suggest it should. The fog was thick enough that visibility had dropped to maybe a quarter mile, which meant I was navigating largely by instrument and by a kind of accumulated instinct for where a disabled boat would actually end up, rather than where it was supposed to end up. I found the Charlotte Ann a little after 5:30, drifted nearly 2 miles south of the Coast Guard search area, exactly where the current pattern I trusted said it would be. The sailboat's engine had failed, and Richard Reyes, 61 years old, according to what I learned afterward, had been unable to raise anyone on a radio that had also failed, sometime during the drift, leaving him alone on a disabled vessel in worsening fog for nearly 4 hours, with no way to signal his position and no way to know whether anyone was looking in the right place. He was cold, badly frightened, and profoundly relieved in the specific, shaking way people are relieved when rescue arrives after they've genuinely begun preparing for the possibility that it might not. I radioed the Coast Guard with the position. They redirected and arrived within 20 minutes to take over the formal recovery, which is appropriate and which I didn't argue with. My job in that moment was to find him and keep him stable until proper rescue resources arrived, not to manage the entire recovery myself. I stayed alongside until the Coast Guard vessel reached us, made sure Richard Reyes was transferred safely, and then turned the Patricia Ann back toward home, soaked and cold, and considerably later getting back than I'd planned, with a haul of shrimp that had sat in the hold considerably longer than ideal. I did not think, in that moment, that this was the end of the story in any particular way. I had done what any capable boat in the area would have done, what several other local captains had also been doing throughout the search. I went home, told Denise what had happened, ate dinner late, and went to bed. Charlotte Reyes came to my house 2 days later. I want to describe what that looked like because it was not the version of this moment you might expect from a dramatic retelling. She did not arrive with flowers or a prepared speech. She arrived in ordinary clothes, without makeup, looking like someone who had spent 2 days in a hospital waiting room and then at her husband's bedside, which is exactly what she had been doing. And she stood on my front porch for a moment before she said anything at all. "I came to thank you," she said, "properly. Not because anyone told me to, because I needed to say it myself." "You're welcome," I said. "I'm glad he's all right." "The Coast Guard told me what happened," she said, "that you went against the search pattern, that you knew something about that water they didn't account for." She paused. "They said if the search had continued on the original pattern through nightfall, the outcome might have been very different. The fog was getting worse. The water temperature that night would have mattered." I didn't say anything to that. I let her get to whatever she'd come to say in her own time. "3 weeks ago," she said, and her voice had a different texture now. Something less composed than the version of her I'd encountered at the dinner. "I told you that boats like yours don't belong in the same water as the boats at my marina. I said it like it was an observation about quality, about fit." She looked down for a moment. "My husband was alive in that water because of 26 years of exactly the kind of knowledge I dismissed as not belonging in my world." "You don't owe me a confession," I said. "I came home that night and went back to work. It didn't cost me anything you need to repay." "It's not about repayment," she said. "It's about accuracy. I've spent years telling myself a story about what kind of water, what kind of people belong near my marina. And the truth turned out to be that the only reason my husband is alive is because the water doesn't actually care about any of the distinctions I've spent so much energy drawing. It just is what it is. And the only person who actually understood it well enough to save him was the man I told not to come to dinner." I thought about Patricia Ann, my grandmother, who never once needed anyone's membership roster to know what she was worth. "The water doesn't read guest lists," I said. Something in Charlotte Reyes's face shifted at that. Not dramatically, not into tears, just into something quieter and more settled than the composed irritation I'd seen at the club 3 weeks earlier. "I'd like to fix what I got wrong," she said. "Not as a favor to you, as a correction to something I should have understood a long time ago. I'm going to bring a proposal back to the harbor community. Full navigational rights, no transit restrictions, formal acknowledgement of the working fleet's role in this stretch of coast. I should have done that years ago, regardless of what happened to Richard. What happened to Richard just removed the last excuse I had for not seeing it." I told her that sounded like a good use of her time. She thanked me again, more simply this time, and left. I don't know if Charlotte Reyes's understanding of the harbor, of the channel, of the people who fish it for a living has changed in any way that will outlast this particular crisis. I've learned over 26 years on this water not to count on permanent change in anyone's understanding, including my own. People learn what circumstances force them to learn, and sometimes that knowledge holds, and sometimes the next calm season erodes it back into the comfortable distinctions they'd rather believe. But I know this. The water out past that shoal doesn't care whose name is on a membership list. It never has. It moves the way it moves, indifferent to every distinction we draw on land about who belongs where. And the only thing that matters, when someone is out there and the fog comes in, is whether anyone nearby has actually spent the years it takes to understand it. I have those years. Nobody can take a membership roster and erase them. If you've ever been told you didn't belong somewhere by someone who later needed exactly what you had to offer, leave a comment below. I read every one. And if you know someone who does quiet, dangerous, underappreciated work on the water, on the road, or anywhere else the comfortable world rarely looks, tell them their knowledge matters, long before any emergency proves it. See you in the next one!